6:33. You want to give it just a couple more minutes?
No, let's go ahead and get going.
Okay.
There's quite a lot to talk about this one.
Okay. So welcome everybody. Some of you are new and some of you have been here before. For the new people, as you may not be aware, passive cash flow for life with multifamily and mobile home parks. Nichole has been teaching this for about 11 years. She's been in the space buying properties for about 25 and decided that she wanted to teach, which she's very good at and she enjoys. So we put together an online class based on an in-person class about 3 years ago, and it's huge. It's like 60 hours, everything that Nichole has learned over 25 years and thousands and thousands and thousands of units across 11 states. And the idea here was to do two things. One is obviously to give back. We do this every Tuesday. It's Teaching Tuesdays. And then for those that are ready, give them an opportunity to actually become a student. We are, for the first time in 4 years, I think pre-COVID, we are going to have a 4-day live class, November 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So if you buy if you buy the online video, you get to come to the class for free, which is usually $3,000. So it's kind of up to you. It's an incentive. I don't know if we'll ever hold one again, but this is something we decided to do. Obviously, you have to either be in the Baltimore, DC area or be able to fly in to the area, BWI, and then get to the hotel. So anyway, from that, I am going to pass it over to you, Nichole.
All right, thanks everybody. So this week, we're talking about land trusts and other kinds of trusts. And I decided to do this. It started out, I was only planning to do one class, but when I started looking at it, I have done in one of our other classes, basically 2 sessions on land trust. There's really a lot to know about them. And so when I really started looking at it, I decided to make this into 3 parts. So this week, and then next week, we have one of my other partners is going to talk about ways to effectively screen residents. She's very, very good at property management. And then the 2 weeks after that, we're going to go back to land trusts. And you can kind of see kind of what on this slide a little bit about what we're going to do. So this week, we're really just going to talk about some of the basics. And one of the things I want to sort of say up front is that there is a whole lot of misunderstanding and misinformation out there about land trusts. I've heard a lot of people say things that just are factually untrue and can get people into a lot of trouble if you listen to that. And I would encourage any of you to not necessarily believe me directly, but to go scope out a little bit of this yourself with attorneys and other people who actually have knowledge about land trusts. So one of the biggest myths out there is that land trusts, if you put a property into a land trust, you are protected from suit, and that just is factually untrue. A land trust or a personal property trust are used for privacy. They're very good for privacy and not exposing who really owns a property, but they offer no liability protection. And so if you have something in a land trust and you as the direct beneficiary and somebody sues, it's going to fall down to you directly. So I just wanted people to understand that. So a land trust, what is it exactly? It's basically anything that holds a piece of real estate, a piece of property, of real property. A personal property trust is something that holds paper. And we're going to go into that a little bit more, but it's important to think about it because we put a piece of property in a land trust, and then the land trust is actually owned by our trustee, and what we own is the beneficial interest of the trust, which is actually a personal property trust. So we're actually owning our personal property as the beneficial interest, the beneficiary of the trust. Okay. So we just talked about they don't offer asset protection. So the best way to use land trusts is in conjunction with LLCs, S and C corps. But in truth of the matter, 90% of the time, we're going to hold property in an LLC. And we'll talk about that at some time in the future. Before putting a property into a land or personal trust, you really need to have your entity in place. So I'm going to kind of go on here, and we're just going to talk a little bit about definitions for a minute. Okay. So a land trust is actually an agreement between the grantee, the trustee, who's the person who is going to take care of the property for you and actually owns the property. The grantor, who is most of the time is you, because you are granting the trustee the ability to, you're granting them the property, and so you're the one that's forming the trust, right? So the trustee is the person who is shown on the deed and actually owns the house. In reality, so I'm going to do something in a side here for just a minute. A lot of the trust agreements that I have seen are a 1-page, 1.5-page agreement. And that's absolutely not adequate. There's a lot of things that need to be covered in a trust agreement that take it generally to somewhere between 5 and 7 pages. And I actually have a couple of examples of trust agreements that at some point I can share if you're interested. But the trustee typically is the person who takes action on the direction of the beneficiary. So they're holding the property for the beneficiary, for the interest of the beneficiary. The beneficiary is typically the entity or person that is entitled to the earnings, to the use of the property. And the grantor or trustor creates the trust. And so those are just the 3 basic people involved. And the land trust is the agreement between those three kind of individuals, etc. So some basics. A land trust is created by basically 2 events. The grantor, that's going to be you for the most part, enters into agreement with a trustee for the benefit of the beneficiary. Now, the beneficiary a lot of times is you, but it can be a child, it can be somebody else. So the grantor and the beneficiary do not have to be the same person, but frequently are. Okay. So what has to happen is the titling of the real property goes to the trustee of the trust. So the trustee is the person who shows up on title when somebody's looking this property up. But they only hold title in their capacity as a trustee. However, there's a caveat here that you really need to think about and to know is that if they wanted to, they could sell that property out from under you and you can't do anything about it. That's why when we assign a trustee, we find somebody that we can trust, right? So it can be a financial friend, it can be a family member, generally should not be a spouse or a child, needs to be just have a little bit of distance from you. Okay, so a land trust is basically the same thing as a revocable living trust. So a revocable living trust is one that a lot of people put their property, put all of their assets into, so that when they die, basically they don't have to go through probate. The trust has already been formed. It owns the asset, and the trust agreement basically says what's to be done with those assets. So you think about a land trust as having basically the same function as a living trust, a revocable living trust, but it holds real estate, it holds real property. Revocable is a key word, means that you can change. If you're the beneficiary, you can change the trustee. You can take the property out of a trust. You'd actually have to tell the trustee that they needed to do that. Just like with a revocable living trust, you can revoke the trust and you can change it if you want to, right? Here's another key. I want you to really pay attention to this, because this is what gets people more often than not, is that once you have formed the trust, a trust is just a document that has been signed, but now you have to fund the trust. And so that's true with a living trust, it's true with a personal property trust, it's true with a land trust, meaning you have to now title that property in the name of the trust. And if you don't, it basically has no meaning whatsoever, right? Trusts also can't be forever. And so you need to keep that in your back of your mind, that generally the limit is about 20 years. And that occurred probably in the 40s, 30s, and 40s, because when people originally set up the trust, they set it up so it's going to be in perpetuity, meaning forever. And that came in where there was a lot of that's where some of the antitrust laws come in that we're dealing with now, because they had an unfair advantage. So if you have some piece of property in a trust, you have to kind of keep an eye on it, because after 20 years, typically, or whatever your state or jurisdiction says, they will tell the trustee that they have to sell the assets of the trust. And so you have to make some kind of changes. You just have to keep an eye on it, right? Okay. So this is my attempt to kind of show you what this looks like in a visual. So before you own the property, either in your own name or an LLC. Now, people do own them in LPs and corporations, but that's not such a good idea. So before you put it in a trust, the title is in the name of your LLC. And whoever controls or owns the LLC has the full ownership rights. All right. So now you're going to put this into a trust. And so the grantor, which is generally you, forms the land trust. The land trust is the key document. The grantor assigns a trustee, and the land trust document is going to say, is going to say who the beneficiary of the trust is. All right. Oops, I wasn't quite through there. Okay. So the beneficiary has all of the benefits of the ownership, and they have a little bit of control, but most of their control is that they can get rid of the trustee. The land trust, the ownership rights in a land trust are divided between the trustee and the beneficiary. So the trustee up here is only supposed to take action on the direction of the beneficiary. So what we're doing, so the land trust, the ownership of the land trust is still in the name of the beneficiary. And in this case, the beneficiary is going to be the LLC. And the LLC, whoever owns the LLC down here, whoever is, so it can be one person, it can be whatever, they are the beneficiary. So the LLC has its own beneficiary. So I'm hoping that's clear. So this is the land trust. The beneficiary is an LLC. The owner of the LLC is the beneficiary of the LLC, so to speak. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these, every one of these, because it can get a little bit boring, I think, but you can come back and ask questions as you want. So the first one is probably the most important to understand, is that the trustee has both legal and equitable title, and the beneficiary has no interest in either. So the name on the deed is the trustee, and the trustee has can sell the property, but they're not supposed to. And that's where your trust document comes in. You need to spell out clearly what the trustee can and can't do. But what typically trustees do is that they can sign, if you want to take a loan out, they can sign for the loan on a property. They can pledge it as collateral, right? Or they can sell the property as they are instructed by the beneficiary. Okay. Most of the time, trustees are indemnified, which means that if something happens, and remember, the beneficiary or you generally have the control of the property. So you collect the rents, you can do whatever, you're supposed to manage the property or do whatever you're supposed to do. So if you do something that is fraudulent, if you do something that harms somebody else, issues are still going to come back on you, because most trusts indemnify the trustee, and they're indemnified from being sued. They're typically indemnified from having to pay expenses. All of those are you as the beneficiary. So the beneficiary, if you look at that bottom box on the left there, is what we already talked about, is what you can do with that trust. So you can manage it, you can control it, you can do the rents, you can take the profits. Okay. Now remember, we said back in that first slide that a land trust holds property, but the benefits of that land trust, so the beneficiary, the benefits of that land trust, is not actually the real property. The benefits are actually personal property. So your beneficiary, so your benefits are actually held in a personal property trust. And that gets a lot of people in trouble too, is that if somebody decides to sue or to try and figure out how to get at the beneficiary, if your beneficial interest is not held in either an LLC or a personal property trust, then it can fall back on you. Okay. most agreements, most trust agreements forbid the disclosure of, forbid the trustee from disclosing who's the beneficiary of the trust. And that's another myth that is out there that a lot of people who are teaching, who do real estate education, will tell you to put things in a land trust because it protects you and the trustee cannot disclose who you are. And for general purposes, that's true. But the minute lawyers get involved and the courts get involved, the courts can compel the trustee to state who is the beneficiary, and they're going to do it. So one of the things that is out there that I've heard people teaching say, well, just change the trustee, and so it can't be found. Well, understand, if you're changing the trustee, you have to retitle that property in the name of the new trustee. And so you're having to go back into records, you're paying now, most of the time you don't have to pay the sales things like you do that are huge, but you do have to pay recordation fees. And so every time you change a trustee, you have to go back into the land records and do it, change the ownership and the title, which typically takes an attorney to do. And you're going to have some fees. So the idea that if something happens and a lawyer comes looking for you, that a trustee won't disclose, that's not true. As soon as the courts get involved, they're going to disclose. But the good news is that basically you are not on the public records anywhere, which goes to the main benefit of trust, which is privacy, or one of the main benefits. So what I want to talk just here a little bit, I think I've already talked about this, is that land trusts give you no statutory protection, meaning that the courts are not going to protect the beneficiary like an LLC. One of the things we'll talk about in a couple of weeks is that there are some times if a minor child is a beneficiary of a trust, the courts will frequently try to protect them. But most of the time there is no protection, which is why we want to put things in an LLC or a corporation. And one of the things that a lot of people talk about land trusts don't understand when they talk about LLCs offer no privacy, is that in most states, not all, but most states, LLCs and corporations are not required to divulge the owners. Now, there is some changes, and we'll talk about that at some time with IRS. This upcoming year, you're going to have to report ownership of anybody who owns more than 20% of an LLC, and whoever's doing your taxes is going to be doing that. But in general, it's not open to everybody. So we put it in a land trust, a personal property trust, with the beneficiary being an LLC, because the LLC does offer statutory protection. Practically, land trusts slow lawyers down. A lot of times lawyers won't go to the effort if they're just on a, kind of ambulance chasing mission, so to speak, to try and go to the work to find out who the beneficiary is, right? All right, we talked about that. Okay, so the biggest benefit of a trust is that your name or the beneficiary's name is not disclosed. A lot more is available now, any of you who do real estate, to know what's in the public records. So one of the things we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks is how do you name land trusts? How do you name them to try and help your privacy? What they do is they insulate the owner from direct communications with buyers or tenants. And you think about Disneyland and Disney World. There is some negative stuff coming out over the last 2, 3, 4 years about land trusts because there were some, I won't say a lot, there were some fairly high profile slum landlords who were using land trusts to protect their privacy so people couldn't sue them. And I've also heard it said that drug dealers use land trusts to protect them, but I don't know that that's true. I can't imagine if somebody's coming after you for drugs that they're going to pay much attention. The courts are going to get involved pretty quick. All right. So that's kind of the basics. I want to talk just a little bit about what we're doing, just kind of a little bit more about who we are and kind of what we're doing here real quick, and then we'll open it up to questions. So if you look at that first passive wealth webinar, if you go, that's kind of our multifamily webinar. It talks about kind of a lot of what we do. And if you watch that to the end, you will see where you are able to sign up for our online course. And until the end of October, that online course is going to include for free a 4-day face-to-face class. Well, if you happen to sign up through the webinar, you're going to save yourself $500. So you get everything for about $14.97, as opposed to coming into our website. And only the people who are watching this kind of are going to know that. So you've got a leg up if you're interested. If you are just interested in what we do, our website is passivecashflowforlife.com. If you have questions, please email us at support@passivecashflowforlife. And that last bullet is basically our YouTube channel. By the end of the week, this Teaching Tuesday will be up on our YouTube channel, where you can watch it again. The other thing is that you will also see all of our Teaching Tuesdays there. There's a long playlist at this point that you can look at. Every Tuesday at 6:30, we do another class, another Teaching Tuesday. It's generally about half an hour. And then we open it up for questions. So at this point, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open it up for questions, and I'm going to kind of stop sharing. And please, you can ask any questions you want about land trusts, basics, or anything else that you want. I've been dealing with land trusts for probably 12, 15 years now. So I'm fairly comfortable with them, although I am not an attorney who focuses on land trusts. And so before you would do anything, I would check with an attorney in the state where you are. All right, questions. Anybody? And if you don't
This
have
is
questions,
Wayne.
hi.
Who's a good trust attorney in Maryland?
I think that let me think. He's in Brian Gomler.
Gallagher?
No, not Gallagher.
No.
Gallagher doesn't deal with trust.
Oh.
It's Gromler.
Grum
Brian
Gormley.
Gormley. Tell me, we got two Brian attorneys, Brian Gallagher and Brian Gormley. So, and he's really pretty good with trusts. He talks about them, etc.
Okay,
Hey, Wayne, I'll put it in the chat.
great.
His email address, and he's in Kensington, Maryland, or he was last time I talked to him, which was about a year ago.
Okay.
And then for everybody else, if you want to just click on the links for the free webinar or the YouTube channel, it'll open up in a separate page so you won't lose it. And then my email address is on there as well as the support one.
All right, we've got a little more time, so please, any questions you have about real estate, if you don't have any questions about trusts at this point. Although I will tell you that what I'm going to talk about in a couple of weeks is probably there's some really pretty interesting stuff you can do with trusts that are not very well known, like marital difficulties and how that can protect you, like avoiding probate if you have properties in more than one state. There's a lot of ways you can use trusts that are not typical in what we just talked about and what most people talk about when they talk about land trusts.
I'm laughing when you said marital difficulties because Stacy popped her head in.
Oh, well, do we need to have a separate conversation about trust, James? I thought
No,
you guys
not
got
at all,
along
but I
pretty
thought it
well.
was interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Other questions, please?
So does the trustee, does that person have like the most power, like the power of attorney, over the beneficiary, or do they both have to communicate with each other?
No, they're going to communicate with each other. So a trustee's power is limited to the property. So they are not, they do not have power of attorney except on that property. And that's why trust agreements are so important, because it lays out how they are supposed to communicate with you. So they're not supposed to take action without direction from the beneficiary. Now, in the case of minors, there's a beneficiary, there can be a manager in between, right, who directs the beneficiary, who directs the trustee. But the trustee is supposed to limit their focus to the to selling the property, paying taxes, kind of answering questions, selling the property if they're directed. So their scope is pretty limited. It's just that you have to know what is possible if they were a not so honorable person, and what your role is and how you pay attention. But you do have to stay in communication. Most of the time, there is very little work for a trustee to do. They may have to do something once or twice a year in terms of filing something, but their work is very, very limited if you're not doing anything with the trust, with the property. Good question.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So let's say you have a trustee that is not honorable. And even though your agreement with them says they may not sell the property, but they have power of attorney, are they able to basically skirt around you and sell the property without you having to sue them on the back end? Or is there a way to keep them from selling the property if they're going to do something dishonest?
Number one, they don't have a power of attorney.
Oh, I thought they did. Okay.
No, they actually own the property. The property is deeded in their name.
Okay.
So they own the property and they have all equitable interest. But the trust agreement says what they can and cannot do. You probably could not stop them from selling that property if they chose to, but your trust agreement is basically a contract. And so you go after them civilly for that breach of contract, which is why that is such an important document to really think through, that it's not a one-pager like a lot of people talk about. You need to have a little bit of depth in it. But that's also why you need to find somebody you trust to make the trustee. It's not somebody Now, there are some actual firms out there who will act as the trustee. But I don't really have much knowledge about that. I've never used them, and I don't know what they charge, but they're not going to do it for free. That answer that?
Yeah, and I'm guessing that putting a lien on the property somehow kind of defeats the purpose, right?
So what are you thinking, James?
So I'm thinking, Joe is not very honest. He's going to try and loop around. He thinks that, I'm not going to go to the trouble to sue him. So he sells the property. If there's a lien on the property, he can't sell it because until that lien gets cleared, and the only person that can clear it is you.
Okay, remember now, I like the idea about the liens or not having a lot of equity. So there's
Right.
you have a financial friend who has a loan against the property. But understand, purporting to have a loan against the property and not is fraud. And so, financial friends take care of each other.
Mhm.
But any time that you are selling a property, anytime you'd have to clear liens, you'd have to clear anything else on the title. And so that is true. That you'd have to, if there's a mortgage, you'd have to clear the mortgage.
Mhm.
But you are not, as a beneficiary, are not on title anywhere. So chances of somebody letting you know what's going on may not be, you may not know what's really going on
Okay,
with
that's fair.
that. So, because you're not on paper anywhere.
Right. Yeah, no, that
And
makes sense.
so you just have to be careful, just a little bit careful.
Right. Okay, great.
Other questions, please?
That was kind of my question, and like that's been one of our hardest things, both for personal property. Like we had a bank account, personal property trust, and like the trustee just didn't pay attention, or they're not available when you need them to sign documents for stuff. So that's like one of our biggest challenges. So you've never actually hired a lawyer or
I haven't. I've always used people that I trust. But a good trust document is going to sort of say what they're supposed to do, what their roles are, and what they get paid, and how you would get documents to them for those kinds of things. So, but I am sure there are lawyers and things out there who act as trustees. I just don't have any personal experience with them. But they might be a pretty safe place to go, because chances of, if they sold a property out from under you, chances of them getting disbarred would be fairly high, I would think.
right. We're not as concerned with the trust issue. It's just like, oh, I'm busy, or I can't get to it today, or whoops,
Oh, okay, yeah.
vacation and I won't be available, or
Yeah, that's what we run into, but if they are trustworthy, the ones we use, it's just life gets
busy.
in the way.
I don't know. I would, I don't have good solutions for that. I mean, if you have something that needs to be done urgently, then you're going to have some kind of an agreement with them
Gotcha.
And
for how
another
to do
thing,
that.
another thing we came across is certain states, the title companies don't really like trusts, and one of the states that really stick out is Mississippi. When we were trying to close on deals in Mississippi, they absolutely do not like land trusts. So that so we've had a couple little pitfalls and issues that we had to work through, and we had to reach around to like 3 or 4 different ones until we got to the right title company who was investor friendly and who would accept the land trust. So
Well, now
but,
that's another thing that I have run into, because Idaho's kind of the same way.
Mhm.
I mean, it's one of them foreign ideas,
yeah,
Mhm.
Nothing against Idaho. That's where I was, where I grew up and was born. But so one of the things you can do is you take ownership in an LLC, and then you form the trust after all the documents are formed, and you're just going to have to pay a different recording fee to get it things. But now you don't have to deal with a closing company or attorney.
Nice.
I mean, kind of like that.
Good
That
solution.
is good to know.
It's fairly easy to just to drop in that land trust after the fact, because you're not really changing the ownership of the LLC. You're just making it the beneficiary of a land trust.
Smart. That's what I'll have to do next
And
time.
at least in Idaho, you probably didn't get bless your heart.
And then we quickly
yeah.
realized-
We thought that was a good thing.
That's how, well, Idaho has some of the same, it's how to kind of zing you with a compliment in front, right?
Right.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's kind of every region has its own. All
It's
right,
funny
other
because,
questions?
I was gonna say trusts have been around like from the beginning of time, but way before other structures, and I don't understand why people, but like some lawyers and title companies just don't like them when they've been around since the Boston Tea Party. I think that's when it started.
I think most of it is because frankly, they don't understand them. And there's a lot of these, a lot of there, and what is out there is that, it's a way of avoiding getting prosecuted. You can do bad things and nobody can find you. And so it's one of those other things that we face a lot of times, I think, about a lot of investors just, are not particularly trusted because people tend to think we're trying to get over something on somebody else.
Yeah, right. That's true.
And so we looked at with a lot of skepticism. So I don't know. All right. Those are good questions. Anything else?
Hi, it's Vicki.
Hi, how
And
are
Larry.
you?
We're great. We're driving to a meeting up in Rhode Island, so we're on the road. We are working with a lawyer to do several things. And one of them was to set up a land trust that we want to put the house we're living into. And
Why a land trust other than a living, a revocable,
well, I
a
think
revocable trust?
I think we've got the same problem on both of them. Larry and I are both on the title for the property,
Mhm.
and we want it to be in an entity that's not our name.
Okay.
So we kept thinking that a land trust was the way to go, but we got a note from the lawyer a couple of days ago that said they can't do it because we're not married.
You can. I don't know where they're saying that because I've seen several times where you have two beneficiaries.
Right. Okay.
So
When I looked up the rules for a living trust, it said the same thing. Is that in Maryland you couldn't? Maybe it's a Maryland thing. That in Maryland you couldn't do a living trust if the people weren't married.
now that may be true that you may have to have two trusts. But with you separate out or together. I just I don't know, but I do know with land trust it's one piece of property. And it's going to be, is it owned by both of you in your own personal names?
Yeah.
Your house?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it would be, I didn't hear that, Larry.
Oh,
I just said that, you know anyone in Maryland that we could speak to?
I would talk to Brian Gormley.
okay.
Have you talked to him at all?
No.
He does a lot of trusts. and he would be able to, in fact, that's his main area, is trusts and wills. So he ought to
Okay.
be able to help you with that. Another person that that I've used, his name is Danny Tregonig, and he's up in Frederick.
Who is that again, please?
Daniel Tregonig, Tregonig.
Okay. You writing, Vicky?
I'm getting something else to write with right now. Brian,
So
where is Brian?
Brian is in Bowie or somewhere around there. Is that right, James?
He's actually in Kensington, and Vicky, I'm
Okay.
sending you an email since you're on the road with Brian's contact information. I don't think
Okay.
I have Danny's.
Yeah, you
And Daniel-
probably don't. Danny does more with living trusts, with living wills. I mean, the revocable trusts.
Okay,
But he
Oh,
is
yes, I do.
he's really good, and he works really well with people. He's just got great people skills. And he's in
Great.
Frederick, Maryland.
Actually, I
Great.
found his email address. I think he did our wills, because this one's out in Frederick. It's Danny Tregoning, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll put that in the email as well, Vicky, and then for
That's
everybody
great.
else, I'll put it in the chat.
thanks, guys.
Mhm.
Appreciate it. Any other questions, Larry? That's it, thanks.
That's a big help.
Yeah. Where do you post the recording, or do you send out an email with the recording? Link.
It's actually on our YouTube channel.
Okay.
So
okay.
if you look at the slide, James, I don't have the slides up. Can you tell him what the URL is, please? Or put it in the chat?
Okay, I'll put it in the chat again, and then I've also attached it or put it in the pasted
Email.
it in the email as well, Vicky.
Thanks, James. That's great.
No problem. Good to see you guys. All right, let me put it up here too.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions.
Wayne
and
has
then-
another question.
Sure, how are you?
Real quick, theoretically, if I purchase a investment property in an LLC, I control the LLC. Can I also control the trust? Create and control the trust?
There are two different documents.
Right.
So realistically, you don't have to have a land trust. What a land trust does is offer privacy, and it offers some other benefits that we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
But they're two separate, totally separate legal documents. So typically, if you use a land trust, you're using that to set up privacy.
Right.
And you are assigning or having the trustee that you're forming is actually going to own the property. You're deeding the property over to the trustee. You
Okay.
do not control that directly. Indirectly, you can control it by the trust document, and that trustees are supposed to only do what you say. And then
Right.
the land trust is owned by the LLC. And you control whatever your operating agreement says is what you can or can't do in terms of your LLC. So
Okay.
the directions for the LLC comes from the operating agreement, and the directions for the trust and the trustee comes from the trust agreement. And that's why if you leave with nothing else, please remember that this one-page trust document just is worth about one page.
Okay.
Right? So, but you don't actually need a land trust. It's for privacy purposes primarily. An
Okay.
LLC offers plenty of liability protection. So a
Okay.
land trust is actually just adding a layer on top of your already liable protection, protection against liability.
For privacy.
Is that clear now?
Yeah.
Is that more
And
clear?
I would be looking at it from the standpoint that you described it, I would look at doing the trust on top of or in conjunction with the LLC for
Yep.
that extra privacy.
Yep, and that's certainly how most people use it. The only place I worry is where they put something into a land trust and have you as a person the beneficiary. And the problem with that is it offers privacy, but you are still personally liable for anything that might happen. And so you just don't want to put yourself in that position for an income producing property.
Right. In that instance, the LLC is the beneficiary.
In this instance, the LLC is the beneficiary of the land trust, and you are the owner of the LLC. So
Right.
you know, that's kind of set up how much of the LLC you own, right?
Right. Okay.
Okay. All right. I think that that's probably pretty good. I mean, we're 7:24, and I'm going to, at this point, unless there's any last minute questions for anybody from anybody here. So remember, next week, my partner Miranda Bolin, who basically owns the biggest property management company in West Virginia and is just a plus owner, property manager, is going to talk about basically how do you screen tenants so you don't have a lot of people getting evicted. How do you screen them for long-term viability? How do you screen that's different for owner finances versus rentals, right? And then the week after that, we're coming back to land trusts, where we're going to talk about some of the more interesting ways that you can use land trust, at least as far as I'm concerned. So let me turn this over to my partners.